Richard Pryor walks onto the set of a late-night talk show, and the atmosphere instantly curdles into pure, uncut anxiety. His team told the press the next morning that Richard was just suffering from a mild flu or extreme exhaustion, which was a convenient Hollywood lie for a man who looked ready to burn the entire studio to the ground. That is a narrative built on sand. The reality is much more dangerous. Richard Pryor on live television was a level of volatility that would get a modern production shut down by legal before the first monologue even ended. You are watching a man dismantle his own career in real time, while a terrified host clings to his desk like a life raft. I don't care if you use a burner account, just make sure you subscribe to hear this, because the industry tried to scrub these moments from history. Some critics love to argue that this was all a carefully calculated PR stunt to boost his rebel persona for his next movie. They think the network executives were backstage laughing. Look at the camera operators. Look at the way the host's knuckles turn white as he stares at the floor. That isn't a staged performance. That is the physical manifestation of a professional realizing they have zero control over the person sitting 3 feet away. If it was scripted, the censors wouldn't have been fumbling with the kill switch with trembling hands. Another theory is that he was simply too far gone on substances to know where the cameras were. That is a lazy explanation for the surgical precision of his anger. Drugs do not give you that kind of timing. He wasn't incoherent. He was hyper-lucid. I don't waste your time, you don't waste mine. Subscribe if you value substance. Read between the lines, and you will see the real disaster wasn't a man losing control, but a man finally deciding to show the world exactly how much he hated the mask he had to wear. Look at the red on-air light, glowing like a heat lamp above the studio floor. It's pulsating. Under the massive overhead stage lights, Richard Pryor isn't just sweating, he's practically melting into the expensive upholstery of the guest chair. You there, sitting at home, you've probably seen the grainy clips on YouTube and thought it was just 70s chaos. You're wrong, this wasn't chaos. This was a targeted demolition. The air in that room didn't just feel heavy, it felt like a vacuum. The audience wasn't laughing. They were holding their breath, waiting for a grenade to go off. Every time Richard leaned forward, the cameramen flinched. They weren't just capturing a moment. They were documenting a crime scene. Now, let's peel back the layers of the first big lie the industry wants you to swallow. People love to say he was just a mess on substances. They point at the twitching fingers and the way he licks his lips every 5 seconds. They say the drugs took the wheel and he was just a passenger in his own body. That is a fairy tale sold by publicists to protect the brand. Look closer at the footage. His timing is microscopic. He isn't missing beats. He is creating new ones. When he insults the sponsors, he isn't slurring. He is looking directly into the lens with the focus of a professional hitman. A man lost in a chemical haze doesn't know where the tally light is on camera 2. Richard knew exactly where it was. He was staring down the barrel of the entire network, and he didn't blink once. The drug narrative is just a convenient shield for people who are too scared to admit that a man could be that angry, while being that soberly aware of the consequences. Stop scrolling and listen to this, because the next theory is even more insulting. Some so-called historians claim this was a pre-planned publicity stunt. They want you to believe that behind the scenes, there was a group of suit-wearing executives rubbing their hands together, dreaming of the ratings. What a joke. Look at the producer in the wings. You can see him in the edge of the frame for a split second. His face isn't happy about the ratings. His face is gray. He is whispering into a headset, probably begging for a commercial break that never comes. The host is literally vibrating with genuine fear. He keeps trying to steer the conversation back to a new movie or a lighthearted anecdote about the weather. Richard just stares at him. Silence. 5 seconds of silence on live TV feels like a goddamn eternity. If this was a stunt, the host would be in on the joke. Instead, he looks like a man watching his life's work get fed into a wood chipper. Read between the lines. This wasn't a PR move. It was a hostage situation where the weapon was the truth. You see the stagehands in the background? They aren't moving. They are frozen. Normally, a set is a hive of activity. Not tonight. Everyone is paralyzed because Richard Pryor just broke the golden rule of show business. He stopped pretending. He stopped playing the character that made the white executives feel safe. He started talking about the money. He started talking about the contracts. He started talking about the literal blood on the floor of the writer's room. And that is where the network really panicked. They could handle a crazy comedian. They couldn't handle a businessman who was willing to set his own bank account on fire just to see the executives scream. If you want the real story that the documentaries won't tell you, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because I'm about to break down the final, most chilling theory of them all. Don't be the person who only knows the surface level gossip. Be the one who knows why the studio doors were locked from the outside that night. The final theory people toss around is that Richard was just having a bad day. A bad day? You have a bad day when you spill coffee on your tie. You don't walk onto a national stage and methodically humiliate the most powerful men in media because of a bad morning. This was an eviction. Richard was evicting himself from the Hollywood darling penthouse. Watch his hands. He isn't holding the microphone like a tool. He's holding it like a blunt instrument. Every time he laughs, it sounds like glass breaking in a quiet room. The audience starts to realize that the person they paid to see isn't there. There is someone else in that chair. Someone who doesn't care if he ever gets invited back. Someone who is looking at the host not as a peer, but as a jailer. The reality that nobody wants to face is that the meltdown was the most honest moment in the history of the medium. The elimination is simple. It wasn't the drugs. It wasn't a stunt. It wasn't a bad mood. It was the moment the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. And when the mask shattered, it cut everyone in the room. Look at the host's knuckles again. He's gripping the desk so hard, his rings are digging into his skin. He knows the show is over, not just for the night, but for the version of Richard Pryor that the world thought they owned. You are watching the birth of a legend and the death of a career simultaneously, and the smell of ozone and burnt bridges is practically coming through the screen. There was no mild flu. There was only a man who decided that being a superstar wasn't worth the price of the gag order. He didn't lose his mind. He found his voice, and it was the loudest thing the network had ever heard. The producers finally cut to black, not because he was failing, but because he was succeeding in telling the one story they hadn't authorized. The story of what happens when the funny man stops laughing and starts looking at the bill. The cameras went dark, the studio went cold, and the industry spent the next 40 years trying to convince you that you didn't see what you actually saw. But the tape doesn't lie. The fear on those faces was real. The fire in Richard's eyes was real. And the silence that followed, that was the sound of a total collapse. The cleanup crew didn't just sweep the floor that night. They tried to sweep Richard's entire reputation under the rug. Within 30 minutes of the cameras going dark, the network's PR department was already working overtime to spin a disaster into a health crisis. They called every major newspaper and news outlet with a prepared script about exhaustion and the pressures of fame. They were desperate to frame this as a man who needed help, rather than a man who had finally seen through the facade. But their damage control was a total failure because you can't fix a bridge after you've watched it explode in high definition. The first theory the suits tried to push was the nervous breakdown angle. They wanted the public to think Richard had simply lost his grip on reality. It was a cheap illusion designed to protect the advertisers. But if you look at the raw footage, you don't see a man who is lost. You see a man who is found. He wasn't stumbling over his words. He was weaponizing them. The second theory was that this was a planned stunt to boost ratings. That's another lie the industry tells itself to feel like it's still in charge. You don't destroy a multi-million-dollar contract for a ratings spike that you won't be around to enjoy. No one intentionally lights their own house on fire just to see the sparks. The final truth is much simpler and much more terrifying for the people in power. This was a calculated act of PR arson. Richard knew exactly what he was doing when he stared into those lenses. He was making himself unemployable for the version of Hollywood he hated. He didn't want the darling title anymore, so he burned the trophy on live television. The immediate fallout was brutal. Sponsors pulled their money, future deals evaporated in the heat of that one night, and the lawyers spent months untangling the legal mess of a star who simply refused to play the game. Only the mentally resilient made it this far into the video. Hit subscribe, Survivor. The lingering damage from that night changed the industry forever. Richard never went back to being the safe, predictable comedian the networks could put on a lunchbox. He spent the rest of his life as the ultimate outsider, a man who had to build his own kingdom because he had permanently barred himself from the one everyone else was fighting to enter. He proved that once you tell the truth that loudly, you can never go back to whispering the lies. The industry moved on, but it never forgot the night the funny man stopped performing and started pointing out where the bodies were buried. Richard Pryor didn't just end a show, he ended an era, and he did it with a smile that told the world he didn't regret a single second of the fire. The physical wreckage was immediate. Network executives scrambled to cut the feed, but the damage was done. Millions of viewers had already seen the mask slip. Richard's dressing room wasn't filled with apologetic agents. It was a ghost town. The phone calls stopped. The lucrative commercial deals for family-friendly products vanished overnight, replaced by the deafening silence of a man who had officially become too real for primetime television. He stood in the middle of the studio as the crew avoided his gaze, knowing he had just torched a fortune. He didn't look like a loser. He looked like a man who had just finished a heavy day of work. It wasn't a mental breakdown. It was a prison break from the velvet handcuffs of a network contract. The industry tried to bury the footage, but you can't bury a revolution once the broadcast signal has already hit the satellites. This was the moment the business realized they couldn't own every soul they because the next industry meltdown is already brewing behind closed doors, and you won't want to miss the fallout. Richard didn't crawl back and beg for forgiveness or sign a generic apology drafted by a PR firm. He used the wreckage of that night to build a raw, unfiltered career that didn't need a network's permission to exist. He traded the safety of a corporate paycheck for the power of his own voice. Today, his name is synonymous with the truth, while the executives who tried to silence him are forgotten footnotes in a dusty archive. He lived the rest of his life as a king in a kingdom of one, proving that a career death sentence can actually be a birth certificate for a legend. He died a free man, leaving behind an industry that is still terrified of the next person who decides to stop joking and start pointing at the cracks in the ceiling.